The Pacific doesn't care about your soul. It crashes against the jagged rocks of Mendocino like it's trying to break the whole coast apart. In the summer of 1888, that cold stretch of California was the last thing Clara Miller still had left. At 24, Clara was already a widow, her youth carved away by the harsh reality of the frontier. Her husband, Thomas, was a man of the earth, now buried in the very soil he tried to tame. He left her 1,000 acres of prime grazing land, a deep water pier, and a target on her back as wide as the horizon. Out here, land wasn't just dirt, it was a reason to kill. The men circling her weren't the romantic outlaws of a dime novel. They were her neighbors, the Blackwood brothers Barrett, Vance, and young Caleb. They played a cruel psychological game they called the visitation. For one ugly stretch that summer, the Blackwood brothers rode out to the ranch 3 times a day just to remind Clara she was alone. Sometimes at dawn, sometimes near supper, sometimes right after midnight when the fog swallowed the coastline whole. They called it the visitation. Not because they wanted the land fast, because they wanted her tired, frightened, and desperate enough to hand it over herself. It was a war of nerves designed to break a woman's spirit until she begged to sign the deed away. But the Blackwoods didn't realize a ghost had just ridden into town, a man carrying 1,000 sins and the kind of skills the world tries to bury.
Now, if you still believe a man ought to keep his word, subscribe to the channel. And tell me down below, what's the weather like where you're listening from tonight?
Now let's get back to the coast. Now, let us return to that July morning when the fog was thick as wool and the first horseman appeared on the ridge. Nathaniel Thorne was 47 years old, and he moved with the slow, agonizing care of a man who had broken every bone in his body at least once. He arrived at the Miller Ranch as the sun struggled to burn through the California mist. He didn't come with fanfare or a tin star. He came because 5 years ago, Thomas Miller had pulled him out of a burning saloon in Nevada and never asked for a dime in return. Nathaniel had spent his life as a professional, the kind of man whispered about in hushed tones but never looked in the eye. They called him the Ghost of the Gila back in the territories, a specter of the gun smoke and the long shadows. Here, he was just a traveler with a duster coated in the dust of 3 states and a horse as tired as his soul. He had promised Thomas he would protect Clara if the world ever turned sour. Thomas had died of a fever, a quiet end for a man who had survived the madness of the plains. Nathaniel hadn't seen his brother in almost 12 years. Some wounds heal crooked, even inside a family. But the world he left behind was screaming for a reckoning. Nathaniel pulled his horse into the tall grass behind the barn just as the 3 Blackwood brothers rode up. He didn't intervene. A professional always scouts the killing floor before he starts digging graves. Barrett Blackwood was built like an oak stump, wide, immovable, and rotting from the inside. He sat on a massive roan horse, looking down at Clara as she stood on her porch with a broom. "Morning, Widow Miller," Barrett called, his voice a low rumble that mimicked the crashing waves. Clara didn't flinch, though her knuckles were white as bone around the broom handle. She had already fired warning shots at the Blackwoods twice that month. Didn't stop them, but it reminded them she wasn't dead yet. "You're early, Barrett," she replied, her voice steady despite the way all 3 men watched her like starving wolves. "Just checking on the livestock," Vance Blackwood chirped with a sickening grin. Vance was the middle brother, thin, wiry, and the kind of man who enjoyed the sound of a bone snapping. He smiled every time somebody got scared, like fear was whiskey and he couldn't get enough of it. Young Caleb, barely 20, just sat there, his eyes darting with a coward's guilt. "The offer stands, Clara," Barrett said, leaning over his saddle horn like a vulture. $500 for the 1,000 acres, and we'll let you keep the house for another year." Clara spat into the dust, the ultimate gesture of frontier defiance. "That land is worth 10 times that, and you know Thomas wouldn't have sold it to a snake like you for $1 million. Barrett's face darkened to the color of a bruised plum. "Thomas is a meal for the worms, Clara, and pride is a luxury a widow can't afford." He tipped his hat, not out of respect, but as a final warning. "We'll be back at noon for your answer. Try to be more neighborly by then." They galloped off, kicking up a cloud of grit that coated Clara's clean porch. Nathaniel watched from the shadow, seeing the moment her shoulders finally slumped. He saw her sit on the top step and cover her face for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stood up, adjusted her apron, and went back to sweeping. That was the moment Nathaniel Thorne decided he wasn't just paying a debt, he was starting a war. He stepped out of the shadows, his spurs giving a light, metallic clink against the hard-packed earth. Claire spun, her hand reaching for a small derringer hidden in her apron pocket. She was fast, Nathaniel noted with a grim approval, but he was already standing still, hands visible, looking like a drifting ranch hand. Thomas always said you had a quick spirit, Nathaniel said softly. Clara froze, her eyes narrowing as she studied the man in the gray duster. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice sharp as a flint strike. "A friend of your husband's," Nathaniel replied, his voice like grinding gravel. "My name is Nathaniel Thorne, and I don't like being in debt to a man who isn't around to collect." Clara lowered her hand, but the suspicion remained. In the 1880s, a stranger was just an outlaw you hadn't met yet. "I don't need charity, Mr. Thorne, and I don't need a drifter dying on my porch." Nathaniel walked to the well and began pumping water for his horse. "I'm not here for charity, Mrs. Miller. I'm here for the Blackwood brothers. I've seen their kind in every territory from the Rio Grande to the Canadian line. They think they're lions because they're hunting a lamb, but they haven't met a wolf yet." Clara looked at his holster, an old Colt, the grip worn smooth by decades of use. It wasn't a showpiece. It looked like a gun that had buried plenty of men already. "They'll be back at noon," Clara warned, "and they don't come for talk anymore." Nathaniel took a long drink from the bucket. The cold water bit at his throat. "Good," he said. "I've always found the midday sun is the best light for seeing a man's true nature." The next 4 hours passed in quiet, careful work. Nathaniel didn't waste time sharpening a knife or cleaning a gun he already knew by heart. He asked Clara for a spool of heavy fishing wire and the old cowbells from the shed. He moved around the perimeter of the ranch with a calculated, predatory grace. He wasn't trying to hold the ranch. He was making sure arrogant men walked into the wrong piece of ground. The Blackwoods understood livestock, but they didn't understand the psychology of the hunted. Nathaniel could already tell what kind of men they were. Barrett was pride, Vance was cruelty, and Caleb looked like a boy already regretting the saddle he rode in on. He rigged a tripwire across the main path, buried under a dusting of fine silt. He hung the bells in the high grass where the wind would catch them just right. Clara watched from the window, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. She had lived in the shadow of fear for so long that this quiet man felt like a fever dream. At 11:30, she brought him a plate of cold ham and a crust of bread. Then both of them heard it, a rifle shot somewhere far up the coastline. Not close enough to kill, just close enough to remind people they could. "Why did Thomas save you?" she asked, her voice a whisper against the rising wind. Nathaniel looked at the horizon, his eyes scanning for the dust clouds of the enemy. "I was a fool who thought he could outrun a fire," he said. "Thomas didn't know me from Adam, but he walked into that smoke anyway. He told me a man's life was worth more than a building, and I've spent 10 years trying to prove him right." Clara looked at his hands. They were steady as the mountains, unlike her own. "They'll kill you, Nathaniel," she whispered. "Barrett has the sheriff in his pocket, and the town looks the other way." Nathaniel finished his bread and stood, the joints in his knees popping like dry wood. "The law is a fine thing when the sun is shining, Clara, but when the fog rolls in, a man is only as good as the steel he carries." "Go inside, close the shutters, and don't come out until the world goes quiet." At exactly noon, the sun was a pale, sickly disk behind the maritime clouds. The thunder of hoofbeats echoed up the cliffside, a sound of impending doom. Nathaniel didn't stand on the porch like a target. He sat in a rocking chair in the deep shadows of the barn, his hat pulled low. The three brothers rode into the yard, their horses lathered and nervous. The ranch was too quiet, even for a widow's home. The sheep had been moved. The wind was the only thing moving the grass. "Widow Miller," Barrett roared, his horse dancing in agitated circles. "It's noon. Bring that paper and a pen." There was no answer, only the creak of a shutter in the wind. Vance spat and drew his revolver, his eyes glinting with a feral heat. Maybe she needs a little encouragement. Barrett, he sneered, aiming at the front door. Nathaniel spoke then, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to rise from the dirt itself. I wouldn't do that if I were you, son. The brothers spun their horses toward the barn, hands hovering over their holsters. Nathaniel remained seated, his hands resting casually on his knees. Who the hell are you? Barrett demanded, his face contorting in rage. A neighbor who's tired of the noise. Nathaniel replied, You three have been kicking up a lot of dust for such a small town. Barrett laughed, a harsh, grating sound like metal on stone. Another drifter looking for a coffin, Vance. Show him what we do to trespassers. Vance didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse forward, revolver raised high, but he never saw the wire. It was tied between two iron-heavy fence posts, hidden by the midday glare. The roan hit the wire at a gallop and buckled, its front legs folding like paper. Vance was launched over the animal's head, hitting the dirt with the sickening thud of a wet sack of flour. His gun spun into the tall grass, lost in the weeds. Nathaniel didn't move from the chair. He just watched the middle brother groan and scramble. Rule number 1, Nathaniel said calmly. Always look where you're riding. Barrett went red with fury and reached for his Colt. But Nathaniel was faster, not with the speed of youth, but with the efficiency of a veteran. Before Barrett could clear leather, Nathaniel fired once. The bullet slammed into the dirt inches from Barrett's horse. The animal screamed, reared sideways, and nearly threw him into the mud. The horse panicked, bolting and dragging Barrett halfway across the yard. Young Caleb sat frozen, his hands shaking so hard he couldn't even grip his reins. Take your brother and go, Nathaniel commanded, his voice cold as the Pacific deep. That was your noon visit. The evening visit will be different. If I see you on this land after the sun touches the water, I stop shooting at the leather and start shooting at the hearts. Vance scrambled up, clutching his badly twisted arm, his face a mask of agony and shock. Barrett regained control of his horse, his eyes burning with a hatred that could scorch the earth. You're a dead man, stranger, Barrett hissed, his voice trembling with humiliated rage. We'll be back at sunset and we won't be coming to talk. They fled, Vance riding double behind Caleb, leaving a trail of blood and dust in the yard. The silence returned, heavier than before, punctuated only by the distant crash of the tide. Nathaniel stood and holstered his gun, noticing a slight tremor in his right hand. Age was a thief that stole your nerves 1 second at a time. Clara opened the shutters, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. You hurt them, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I inconvenienced them, Nathaniel corrected. Barrett is a man who thinks he's a king, and he won't stop until he sees my head on a pike. He'll go to town, he'll gather his men, and he'll come back for blood. Clara walked down the steps, her eyes searching his weathered face. Who are you, Nathaniel? You aren't just a friend of Thomas's. Nathaniel looked out at the churning gray ocean. I was his brother, he said quietly. Clara blinked, her mouth falling open in shock. Thomas hardly ever spoke about his family. He wasn't proud of me, Clara. Nathaniel explained that his eyes didn't. He went one way, into the light and the hard work of the soil. I went the other, into the shadows. We shared the same blood, but we didn't share the same life. He changed his name when he came to California to leave the Thorn name in the Missouri mud. I kept it because it's the only thing I have left. Clara sat on the porch, her mind spinning as she looked at this legendary gunslinger. Thomas was the anchor, but Nathaniel was the storm. He loved you, Clara whispered. In his letters, he spoke of a man who was lost but had the heart of a lion. He was talking about you. Nathaniel felt a lump in his throat that no amount of frontier whiskey could wash away. He was a better man than I'll ever be, Nathaniel said, and I won't let his land go to vultures. Now, listen closely. They'll be back for the sunset visit with 10 men at least. A head-on fight is for fools. We're going to use the geography against them. Mendocino is a land of cliffs and fog, and tonight the fog is our only friend. Nathaniel spent the afternoon moving Clara to the lighthouse ruins on the northern edge of the property. It was a stone structure, half crumbled, sitting on a narrow peninsula with only one way in. He gave Clara his secondary revolver, his eyes locking onto hers. If anyone comes up that path who isn't me, you fire, don't hesitate. The Blackwoods don't understand mercy. They only understand consequence. He returned to the house and began destroying the fence lines he had worked so hard to maintain. He knew Barrett would try to surround the house with his riders. By breaking the fences, he created a chaotic labyrinth of tangled wire and downed timber. As the sun began to sink, the Mendocino fog rolled in like a heavy, gray shroud. Visibility dropped to 10 feet, turning the world into a realm of ghosts and shadows. Nathaniel Thorne stood in the middle of the yard, a silent specter in the mist. He wasn't afraid. A man who has lived 47 years in the dark loses the capacity for fear. He heard them before he saw them, the muffled rhythm of a dozen horses. "Thorne," Barrett's voice echoed through the fog, sounding disembodied and hollow. "I've got the sheriff's men with me. You're a wanted man. Surrender the widow and the land, and we might let you reach the jail alive." Nathaniel didn't answer with words. He fired a single shot into the air and moved instantly. The Blackwood ranch hands started shooting blindly into the gray wall of mist. Nathaniel began to whistle a low, mournful Missouri tune from their childhood. It drifted through the fog, spooking the horses and chilling the blood of the attackers. "Where is he?" Vance's voice screamed, high and frantic with pain. Nathaniel triggered the cowbells he had rigged, the metallic clanging sending the riders into a frenzy. They fired at the sounds, hitting their own fences, their own horses, and each other. It was the kind of fear that breaks men before bullets ever do. One by one, the ranch hands broke. They were bullies, not soldiers. When the bullets started coming from the shadows, they realized $5 a day wasn't worth a shallow grave. Horses bolted into the dark, and men screamed as they tripped over the hidden wires. Somewhere deep in the fog, a man screamed for his horse and never got an answer back. Within minutes, only Barrett and Vance remained in the killing field. Caleb had fled at the first sound of the whistle, his cowardice finally saving him. Nathaniel stepped out of the fog, 10 feet in front of Barrett. The mist parted just enough to reveal the gray duster and the steady, unblinking eye of the Colt. "It's over." "Barrett," Nathaniel said, his voice like the closing of a coffin lid. "Your men are gone. Your brother's halfway to San Francisco, and the law doesn't care about dead thieves." Barrett was panting, his face a mask of sweat and terror. He tried to raise his revolver, but his spirit was already broken. Nathaniel didn't shoot. He stepped forward and slapped the gun from Barrett's hand. "You aren't worth the lead, Barrett." Nathaniel spat with pure contempt. "You're a small man who grew fat on other people's fear. You're going to leave Mendocino and sign those papers tomorrow. You've got one day to do it. After that, I ride south to your ranch, and I swear to God, Barrett, every barn you own will burn before winter. If I ever see your face on this coast again, I won't use a tripwire, I'll use a rope." Barrett collapsed into the mud, the reality of his own insignificance finally hitting him. The 3-times-a-day visits were over, buried in the Mendocino fog. The next morning, the sky was a clear, sparkling blue, the air smelling of fresh salt and pine. Nathaniel stood at the land office, watching Barrett sign the documents with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. The townspeople watched in a heavy silence. They knew who he was now. The rumors of the ghost of the Gila had finally caught up to the man, but Nathaniel didn't care for the whispers of the living. He walked back to the ranch where Clara was waiting, the weight finally gone from her eyes. "You're leaving?" she said, seeing his horse saddled and ready for the trail. Nathaniel looked at his brother's grave on the hill, the sun catching the rough-hewn stone. "I've got a few more debts to settle down south," he said softly, "but I think I'll be back. Thomas always said this was the best place in the world to watch the sunset." Clara walked down the steps and took his weathered hand in hers. "You saved me, Nathaniel." "Thomas saved me once," he replied. "I'm just passing it on. Keep the spring clean, and don't let anyone ride up to your door unless they're bringing flowers." He tipped his hat, climbed into the saddle, and rode south along the cliffside road. He didn't look back, but he could feel the warmth of the sun on his tired shoulders. For the first time in his life, the ghost felt like a man again. Not a gun, not a rumor, not a shadow people whispered about over whiskey, just a tired older brother who finally kept his promise. Now, as an old man sharing this story, I want you to remember something important. The world is always going to be full of Blackwood brothers, men who take because they can. But the world is also full of Nathaniel Thorne's men who move in silence and wait for the fog. Don't be afraid of the dawn, the noon, or the sunset visit. Just make sure your heart is steady and your fences are strong. Decency is a choice we make every single morning we wake up.
If you want to keep hearing about the men and women who made that choice, hit that subscribe button.
I want to hear from you in the comments. Who was the Nathaniel Thorne in your life? Who stood for you when the fog was too thick to see the path ahead until our trails cross again? Keep your powder dry and your soul honest. This story was inspired by the legends of the California coast and the hard-won justice of 1888. The names may change, but the spirit of the frontier is eternal. Some scenes and visuals were recreated with modern tools to help bring this old frontier story back to life. Take care of each other out there in the wild. The Pacific keeps rolling in, washing away the blood. But the land remembers. It remembers the man in the gray duster who rode out of the mist to settle a debt. And it remembers the widow who stood her ground when the world tried to take it. That's the thing about the West. It doesn't give you anything for free. You have to earn your peace, one sunset at a time.